Good afternoon, and welcome to this session on tackling financial crime, staying ahead of the criminals. Thank you so much for joining us today. So the way that this is going to work is that what we'll do is we'll see a recording of the presentation that happened at our compliance officer's conference, which happened a couple of weeks ago in Birmingham. But what we do want is for this session to be as interactive as possible. So what we'll do then is we'll have some time after that recording for some new live question and answers. And I'm joined by the panelists from the session. So that's myself, Colette Best, Director of Anti-Money Laundering at the Solicitors Regulation Authority. But I'm also delighted to be joined by Oliver Bullough, author and journalist, and Maya Lester Casey, barrister from Brick Court Chambers. So we'll all be here to answer your questions. So you've got approximately just under an hour of the recording, and then we've got around 15 minutes to take questions. So if you'd like to ask a question of anyone on the panel, what you'll need to do is there should be a link just below the broadcast. So click on that link and submit your question. It's really nice to know your name if you're happy to put your name by it. But if you want, you can submit questions anonymously if you would rather. So I'll really look forward to taking some of your questions in a moment. But first, let's go on to the recording.
So I've got about 10 minutes to speak about the current state of play, what we're seeing in the world of anti-money laundering, the current threat as we see it, but also legal industry's response to that threat and sort of where we want to be, ideally this time next year. So money laundering, sanctions, financial crime are very real threats facing the UK. The NCA says that at the moment there's 59,000 known organised crime criminals operating in the UK. So this is a very real, a very tangible threat to us in the UK. And globally, over the last year, we've seen the importance of the financial sanctions regime as part of a crucial part of the war in Ukraine. And actually, I put these slides together a fortnight ago. They're already looking out of date with the situation in the Middle East. We still don't know what controls and what might come out of that. But I think it's fair to say at the moment this is such a fast changing area, both sort of geopolitically across the world, but also at home. And as Ben says, there are really important local implications as well. It's about keeping drug dealers out of your local communities. So let me just speak a little bit about what's going on closer to home on the legislative sense. So the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill has had what we think might be its final reading in Parliament today, and we're expecting that to gain royal assent possibly early November in the King's speech. And that will bring about a suite of changes to how we supervise, some of which Paul touched upon in his presentation this morning. So it will give us, as Paul mentioned, unlimited fining powers in respect of economic crime breaches. It will also give us wider information gathering powers. And it will also give us, as the SRA, a new regulatory objective to promote the prevention and detection of economic crime, which will be actively supervised by the Legal Services Board. Another big thing going on, which you'll probably have seen, is that the Treasury has recently consulted on changes to AML supervision. And so they've put forward 4 potential different models for the future of AML supervision. In option 1, our anti-money laundering oversight supervisor, OPBAS, that's the Office of Professional Body Anti-Money Laundering Supervision, would gain additional powers and would be strengthened. In option 2, there would be consolidation of legal and accountancy. So there would then be a single AML regulator, either for the whole of the UK or for England and Wales. Option 3, a brand new body would be set up to do AML supervision for lawyers and accountants. And then option 4 would be a brand new body set up to do AML supervision across the board. So that would include banks and casinos. So that's got the potential to bring really big changes over the next few years. So that's definitely one to watch. A couple of other things coming up, which I alluded to in my presentation this morning, is we've got several consultations coming up that Treasury is running on the regulations themselves. So what we're expecting fairly imminently is a consultation on a change to the regulations about PEPs, politically exposed persons, and that's posing the question, should domestic politically exposed persons be treated differently to those overseas? Should they be considered lower risk? And then later on in the year, one which is going to be really important for those of you who are active in this area to respond to, is a consultation on the money laundering regulations themselves. So that's your chance to get your views heard on the regulations. So the current picture is this. As Paul said this morning, what we're seeing is firms still struggling with the basics of identifying and managing money laundering risk. And as I've said, we published our annual report into AML last Friday, and what it shows is actually the levels of compliance that we're seeing in firm-wide risk assessments in particular, but also policies, procedures and controls and matter risk assessments have remained broadly the same year on year. And from the desk-based inspections and on-site inspections that we've done over the last year, we've found that around 20% of them are compliant across the board with their responsibilities under the money laundering regulations, around half partially compliant, and a significant minority of 30% still non-compliant. And we'd really like to start to see those figures improve year on year. So as I said, we've seen firms still not getting the basic building blocks of AML compliance right, which I'm going to touch on briefly in a minute. But in not doing so, this really is leaving your firm open to abuse by criminals if you're not putting these building blocks in place. So let me first speak about the basics of what we would expect to see. So I covered some of these this morning, so actually what I'm going to focus on is the aspects of assessing risk, because this is, I think, a really essential part of the regulations. It's a risk-based approach, meaning you should be putting your resources into the areas of higher risk. And if you don't know what those areas of risk are, you're completely setting yourself up to fail to begin with. So a firm-wide risk assessment is the backbone of your AML controls. And as I said again this morning, if you don't get that right, everything else that flows from it, you're going to really struggle with. There's loads of help available to help you do this. So we've published in this area a suite of guidance. There's also a template. There's a checklist to help you either put in place or review a firm-wide risk assessment. And we've also just updated this guidance as well. So some of the things that have come out recently are included, and that's the requirement to have a proliferation financing risk assessment. If you're thinking about doing business in AI, if you're doing cryptocurrency, some pointers about that is included. So I think the stat to draw out from this is that although most firms, we are not going out there and find they don't have a firm-wide risk assessment in place at all, we're still not seeing compliance here. So just under half of firms that we assessed were compliant with the requirements of firm-wide risk assessments. And then assessing risk at client and matter level. So Paul spoke about this in his opening session. Hopefully you caught the lunchtime breakout on this as well. But client and matter risk assessments are super important because they decide what level of customer due diligence you're going to do for each individual client and matter, and also what ongoing monitoring you need to do. So what we've had for a few years now is concerns that firms are not doing this element of assessing and mitigating their risk well. And that's essentially what we've found through our thematic review. So across the board, we reviewed 1,245 files, of which 21% didn't include a client matter risk assessment. 43% of client and matter risk assessments didn't clearly show enhanced due diligence were necessary. And what we found was approximately half of them were ineffective. So in doing that, we found that a lot of firms were actually then not on an individual client and matter basis able to know where the risk lies and mitigate that properly. So those are the basic controls and processes that you need to have in place, and I spoke a bit about this morning. But what I'd like to focus on this afternoon is what sits around those controls. So it's all very well having perfect policies, having a great firm-wide risk assessment, but if no one knows about them, if no one is using them, if your firm isn't using them in practice, then they're no good to anyone. So this is what we're seeing. Let me speak briefly about what we're seeing, about how they're used in practice. So all too frequently, we do see really good policies, procedures and controls, or a really good firm-wide risk assessment, that when we do assessments at matter level, when we do file reviews, we find that they're just not being used in practice. And it's important because actually using them in practice, as I say, is what will turn money laundering, anti-money laundering, from a tick box paper exercise to something which is actually what we all want to be doing, which is stopping criminals. And I think part of that is about creating this culture of compliance. And I think one of the things that worries me is that compliance is sort of delegated to a compliance function, and it's not marbled throughout the entirety of the firm. So I think what we would say, particularly to senior managers, is that this is everyone's responsibility. It's really important that actually compliance isn't just the responsibility of the few people sat in a compliance team, that it's everyone's responsibility to get this right. And actually that culture really is created as a tone from the top. So if you've got managing partners that aren't giving this message, it's going to be really challenging for those actually trying to put these things in place. So it's not okay for compliance to solely be the responsibility of centralised compliance team. It's fee earners, senior leaders that must take responsibility. So what can you do off the back of today's conference? Because we know that actually the vast majority of people want to do the right thing. You have stayed for this final session on AML. You clearly are people that do want to do the right thing and make a difference. So a few things that you can go away and do. As I said, our annual report was published last week, and that sets out in a lot more detail areas of good and poor practice, so where we're seeing firms are doing really well, but also the areas that firms are struggling with. So you can learn from some of the inspections that we've done. You can review your firm's controls to make sure that they're still fit for purpose and whether you need to make any changes. And as I said, the landscape is changing so fast at the moment, and Maya's going to speak a bit about sanctions changes, but it is incredible just how quickly things move on. So if you're only reviewing your processes every year or so, you do potentially risk missing something if you're not also reacting to events. And then finally, training is important. This is going to be a bit of a theme of what I say this afternoon. But again, you can have the best processes and controls in the world, but if people don't know them, if they don't understand them, if they don't understand why they're doing these things, then actually they won't work to prevent your firm from being used to launder money. And actually, we see, as you'd completely expect time and time again when we go out and do inspections, firms that have got really good training in place, firms that have got good engagement with training, they're the ones that get good outcomes across the board. So it really does seem to be sort of a bit of a magic bullet here. And of course, training is twofold. So of course, you'll want to train your staff on the legislation, the legal requirements, but actually it's really important that the training is twofold, and actually it's about these are the processes in your firm, this is how we do business, this is our attitude to risk, you know, this is where you go if you spot something suspicious. So let me just say a word or two about what we're doing at the SRA. So, as I said, we've published masses of guidance in this area. So have a look online. So you can go to sra.org.uk/AML for all the AML guidance, sra.org.uk/sanctions for our new dedicated sanctions guidance webpage. And as I said, this morning, we've published a suite of documents on client matter risk assessments. So we've published a warning notice, which sets out where we've seen poor compliance in this area and what we expect to see happening. We've published some guidance and a report, and we've also published a template client and matter risk assessment, which is similar to the firm-wide risk assessment that we published back in 2019. You don't have to use it. If you've got something that's working for you, stick with it, but it's out there if you want to make use of it. We're also stepping up our proactive supervision. So again, the number of desk-based reviews and on-site inspections are increasing year on year. So your chances of your number coming up is increasing. So don't wait until you get the letter. Now is the time to put your ducks in a row, get your documents in order. And as of this week, we have started a brand new program of proactive sanctions inspections. So we'll be going out to firms, and those are firms not just in scope of the money laundering regulations, it can be any firm, to check what they are doing to prevent sanctions breaches and make sure they've got good controls in place. And that will be looking very heavily at firms' processes, controls, but also what systems they've got in place and how they're using them. So if you've got an electronic due diligence system, we'll be looking at that very closely as well, because if you're using electronic due diligence, you're putting a lot of faith in those results being right. As I said a moment ago, training, really important. I've spoken about our recent thematic review into client and matter risk assessments. Our thematic review that will be kicking off next year will be into AML training. So we could well be coming to ask you what you do at your firm. So that's both looking to see good practice, what works for you, but also to identify areas of poor practice, and we'll probably be speaking to that this time next year. So we'll continue to take enforcement action where appropriate. So in the last reporting year, we issued 23 fines totaling 61,000, and we made 43 decisions relating to anti-money laundering concerns. And let me just speak briefly, because I think this is helpful, about the themes that contributed to those breaches. So again, inadequate importance placed on having robust and compliant AML risk assessments, policies, controls and procedures, and that is oftentimes because of a lack of attention to this at senior level. Secondly, inadequate supervision or training. And then thirdly, having systems and controls that don't provide automatic checks, so they allow things to happen unchecked. So, for example, money to be paid into the client account before customer due diligence is completed. And as Paul said earlier, in the coming year, we're anticipating that we'll be getting unlimited fining powers for economic crime breaches. So that's something to be aware of. And we're also going to be consulting on whether we would want to use fixed financial penalties for AML breaches as well. So finally, the total cost to the UK of economic crime is £8.4 billion a year. So this is and remains a massive problem. Just to put that in context, that's the total value of all of the UK, England and Wales Premiership clubs put together. Or alternatively, it's enough money to end youth homelessness. So it is very much everyone's responsibility to make sure that we are doing our best to prevent it. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Oliver.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I suspect that you, like me, are rather looking forward to hearing what Maya has to say, so I'm going to be quick. I'm not a compliance officer. I'm a journalist, but I do seem to spend quite a lot of time at compliance conferences because I'm interested in financial crime, and I write a lot about financial crime. I had the opportunity earlier this year to play around with the latest artificial intelligence compliance technology, which was jaw-droppingly extraordinary. It would take a spreadsheet of transactions, identify the suspicious ones, put them in a form, write a narrative around them explaining why they were suspicious, translate it into any one of an entire drop-down menu of languages, and send it all off to the regulator without, as far as I could tell, a human having to be involved at all. And this is just the beginning. The sheer technology involved in compliance is amazing. And it should be, because this is, according to LexisNexis anyway, is this moving? No. Oh, yeah, there we go. A $274 billion industry, compliance. You are all part of a truly enormous global effort to stop financial crime, a real machine all around the world, many cogs, some larger, some smaller, but all working together. The bad news is that it's a complete failure. No offense. The earliest estimate of the volume of money being laundered around the world was made by Michel Camdessu, then head of the International Monetary Fund, in 1998. At a speech he gave that year, he estimated that the volume of money being laundered annually was equal to between 2 and 5% of global GDP. Now, I have recently spoken to one of the people who was in the lift with him on the way to that particular event, and it turns out it was a number that they more or less came up with off the top of their collective heads. But what is interesting about it is that to this day it is a number that is regularly used as an estimate of the volume of money being laundered around the world. There is no suggestion that that sum that he came up with is now an overestimate. In fact, if anything, people talk about it more as an underestimate, despite all of the efforts that have been put into fighting money laundering since the late 1990s, and that has been an awful lot. It's not just the expenditure of hundreds of billions of dollars every year on compliance, it's also the new legislation, the USA Patriot Act, obviously, that followed 9/11, the sanctions that have come in since the war in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February last year, and so on. All of that has essentially done nothing but keep the volume of money being laundered at between 2 and 5% of global GDP. Now, that does sound a little bit abstract, but fortunately, for our purposes, certainly for mine, because mathematics isn't my strong point, global GDP is approximately $100 trillion, slightly more than that. So that's an easy sum even for me to do. 2 to 5% of global GDP is between 2 and 5 trillion US dollars being laundered globally every year. Now, if like me, you're not strong at mathematics and you struggle with the difference between all the numbers that end in illion, if you had a trillion US dollars in a pile in front of you and you settled down to count them $1 a second until you were done, it would take you just over 30,000 years. It is a colossal amount of money. The amount being laundered every year, therefore, is between 60 and 150 trillion dollars. If you think about that in terms of the victims of that, it's an almost unimaginable amount of human suffering. I spent a lot of time living in Russia. I would quite regularly be shaken down for bribes by corrupt police officers, as was everyone I knew. The amount of money you would pay at a time might be $4, it might be $5, it might be $10. It takes a lot of $4, $5, and $10 to scale up to $150 trillion. That is how many victims of financial crime there are around the world. Now, I'm currently researching a book trying to work out why it is that, despite all the work and money we've been spending on fighting money laundering, we have as a civilization so signally failed to stop it. And I found it helpful to try and go back in time to the beginning of this effort when complexity was less and therefore the problem is easier to see. And that means I get to go back to this period. Many of you may recognize these two gentlemen. They are, of course, the two lead characters from the 1980s cop epic Miami Vice. I wasn't allowed to watch this in the 1980s. I wasn't really allowed to watch anything apart from Blue Peter, but fortunately, my friend Martin's parents were not nearly so restrictive, so I got to watch and marvel at the huge hair, the t-shirt under baggy suit combo, the fast cars, the yachts, the alligator called Elvis, and all the rest of it. This is when the fight against money laundering began in Florida in the 1980s, Operation Greenback, amazingly called. The Americans always have the best names for their law enforcement operations. And what's extraordinary is the more detectives and officers I talked to who were involved in that early Operation Greenback effort, the more I realized that Miami Vice was not really a drama at all, but a documentary. It was a genuinely bizarre time in which money laundering was a very, very obvious thing indeed. In 1979, there was one bank in Miami with $37 million in deposits. It's a small bank by American standards, small bank by anyone's standards. And it returned that year $600 million in cash to the Federal Reserve. Small bank taking in $600 million in cash across the counter. I think it wouldn't take a very gifted compliance officer to recognize that that was a red flag. Sadly, I don't think they had any compliance officers. The whole of South Florida at the time was returning $5 billion of cash to the Federal Reserve at a time when all other branches of the Federal Reserve all across the US were receiving money from the central government. So an operation was launched, and they sat outside banks to try and work out which ones were moving all of this money. Money laundering was not sophisticated. It just involved a box of money being taken into a bank and put into an account or changed for a cashier's check, as the case may be. In one particular case I was hearing about from a chap I've been talking to quite a lot this year, they were staking out a bank, and every day a courier would arrive working for one of the cartels with a car full of cash. And then he would go into the bank, security guard, and he would come out with a trolley, and they would take the boxes into the bank where they'd be paid into the account. On this particular occasion, he left the car in the parking lot, went in to get the security guard, and a car thief saw his opportunity, jumped into the car and drove away. So when the courier comes out, there is no car and no money. The security guard says, "Oh, it's okay, I'll call the cops." He says, No, it's fine, just call me a taxi. Next day, he came back in a different car, once again full of money. It was just one day's taking, they could write that off. So the feds moved in. You were technically supposed to report any transaction over $10,000 in cash. All of these banks got busted, and so that loophole was closed. But did that stop money laundering? No, obviously it didn't. The criminals discovered very quickly that all they had to do was put the money in a jet, fly it out of the United States to the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands, Panama or elsewhere, pay it into a bank there. That was also illegal. You had to fill in a form if you were exporting that volume of cash. So the feds cracked down on that. Did that stop money laundering? No, it didn't. The criminals realized that all they had to do was split the money up into smaller packages, each one slightly smaller than $10,000, and no law would be being broken when they paid it into the bank. This caused great confusion to the operatives and the agents who were watching them, because suddenly there was an army of cash couriers running around, just going from bank to bank to bank, and no one could figure out what they were doing. They seemed to have an endless amount of time on their hands and nothing to do. Now, the two of the detectives I've been talking to had young kids who were obsessed by a particular cartoon that was then current, another TV show I wasn't allowed to watch, which featured little blue guys in white hats who never seemed to do anything either. There they are. So they called these cash couriers Smurfs. And to this day, we call breaking up transactions into smaller quantities Smurfing. That's where it comes from. Two detectives whose kids liked the Smurfs and who couldn't figure out what it was they were seeing. Of course, they closed that loophole. People could no longer pay in $9,990 packages of cash. Did that stop money laundering? No, of course it didn't. Because the criminals always adapt. They adapt very, very quickly because they want to keep laundering their money, or the profit is taken out of their crime. Similar thing, of course, was happening in this country. I don't know if any of you watched The Gold earlier this year about the Brinksmat robbery. Alongside it, the BBC produced a small, actually very good, hour-long documentary about the Brinksmat robbery that featured this amazing encounter with Barclays Bank, a small branch of Barclays near Bristol, which had the account of a gold company, which suddenly went from paying in relatively small amounts of money to paying in literally hundreds of thousands every month in cash. So much that they had to bring in whole new cash couriers to deal with it. The bank, though they recognized that the largest bullion heist of all time had taken place literally weeks earlier, did not feel any obligation to report this to the authorities because it was their customers' business and nothing to do with them. Money laundering was really easy in the good old days. Or the bad old days, depending on how you look at it. Of course, it's now much more complicated. It is an acronym-heavy business, as you know far better than me, involving shell companies and nominee directors and third suspicious jurisdictions and blacklists and the FATF and the UK FIU and FinCEN and all the other rigmarole that we all have to deal with every day. But none of it has stopped money laundering. We just have the same process that was seen in Florida in the early 1980s, repeated globally with every new change, brings about a response from the criminals. And this, although this session is called Staying Ahead of the Criminals, the reverse is actually true. Sadly, because of the dynamics of money laundering and how it works, the criminals are always ahead of the good guys. And the reasons for that are pretty obvious, really. One, they're criminals. They don't have to worry about obeying the law. In fact, kind of the fact that they don't obey the law is pretty much the definition of what they get up to. They don't have to worry about the jurisdictions they operate in because they can operate anywhere and everywhere at any one time. They don't have to worry about the Data Protection Act They don't get subject access requests for information that they keep on other people. In fact, they get to exploit the Data Protection Act to hide their information behind shell companies now in the European Union and so on. So if criminals always have the advantage and the entire $274 billion global compliance industry is failing, what should we do about that? I have a friend, a professor at Cambridge University called Jason Sharman, who has a very wicked sense of humor, who around this point, if he does a talk, will suggest that we should just abolish compliance altogether. This always elicits a sort of nervous laugh from his audience as they see their jobs disappearing. His point is that since the compliance is achieving nothing, we may as well save the money. I don't agree with that. I think that compliance could achieve something if it were done differently. I think that too often the way compliance is done is acting almost as if we were all an artificial intelligence machine just implementing an algorithm, rather than if we were human intelligence machines who are able to assess something and work out for ourselves what is and isn't suspicious. I'll give an example of what compliance shouldn't be like. I have a friend called Hamish. His father received a Victoria Cross fighting alongside Somali troops in Somaliland, then a British colony during the Second World War. In recognition of his sergeant, Somali sergeant, who died alongside him, he sold the Victoria Cross in order to raise money for a Somali cultural centre, which actually, funnily enough, is just down the road from where I live in Wales. Every year they welcome young ethnic Somalis who live in British cities and take them camping in the countryside to try and give them a taste of the outdoor life and a taste of what they would be able to get in Somalia, where they would be able to go and stay with grandparents and so on who live outside of the city. Now, inevitably, a lot of the people who provide money to his cultural centre are Somalis, and they have Muslim names. He found that every single time he organised an excursion, he was called by a bank compliance officer who would ask him the same questions every single time. Who are these people? Why are they giving you money? Have you checked the source of funds? These were coming from Somali cultural centres in Birmingham, in London, in Manchester, and so on, month after month after month. Every single call would take hours of his time and achieved absolutely nothing. He had a friend recently from Birmingham, in fact, who had her account closed simply because she was collecting money from other Somalis in order to pay for a camping holiday. It is obviously ludicrous to imagine that that would happen if she did not have a Somali name. That is precisely what compliance should not be. And yet, sadly, to this day, I mean, this is literally happening months ago, to this day, that is what compliance can be. An automated process. Say, well, Somalia is a high-risk jurisdiction. These people have Somali names. Let's harass them until they go away. Which indeed they did. Hamish closed his account, moved to a different account. She then eventually had to use her son's account in order to pay for this camping holiday for her friends and neighbours' children to go on. So what should compliance look like if it doesn't look like that? Well, to be honest, I had to scratch around a bit for a good example, I'm not going to lie, because too often compliance seems to be a process of box ticking. But the example that I finally came up with was in the United States, a gentleman called Barry Koch, who in 2010 was working as lead counsel for JP Morgan in New York. He became very concerned about human trafficking. He'd read about cases of women being trafficked into the United States who were being forced to work as sex workers in Manhattan. And he was worried that some of the money that was being earned by the gangs exploiting them was going through the accounts of the company that he worked for. Now, he could easily have looked into this by just doing some kind of automated algorithm, looking for red flags, maybe looking for for risky jurisdictions, the kind of places listed by the FATF, but he didn't do that. Instead, he looked into the criminal cases that there had been into these gangs, and he recognized that often the brothels that they ran were hidden behind nail bars, so they looked like legitimate businesses, and they could run their money through nail bar accounts. Well, how do you tell whether a transaction going through a nail bar account is actually being run by paying for prostitution? Well, he thought about that. Obviously, There's no obvious red flag. It's still a transaction being run through the account of a nail bar. But it struck him that no one gets a manicure between the hours of 12 at night and 6 in the morning. So he put a system to flag any account owned by a nail bar with money running through it in the middle of the night. And these were suspiciously large transactions, $100, $200, far more than it normally costs, as I understand it, for a manicure. It's not something I regularly do myself. Identified a number of businesses that were clearly fronting for brothels, sent that to the authorities, and the entire people trafficking ring was busted. That's using your brain, using human intelligence against criminals. Because the issue is that criminals, and I'm guessing you probably would all agree with me, criminals tend to be paid more than the rest of us. That's why they do the job. They take the risks of being criminals because it's worth it for them to be earn money, to earn the big bucks that they get paid. They are therefore highly motivated to continue laundering money. So in order to fight back against them, we need to be as motivated as they are, and we need to be as imaginative as they are. And that, I think, is what the story of Barry Cox, imaginative personal vendetta against the brothels of Manhattan did, which it just showed that one guy who recognizes what he's up against, who thinks about it from the perspective of the criminals, spots their vulnerability, and then approaches it not by just going after people with Somali names, but going after people who spend $100 at a nail bar at 2 o'clock in the morning. He set up the Banks Alliance Against Trafficking, or was part of a team that set that up along with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. They published toolkits which are available online for financial institutions to try and use those kind of techniques in their compliance work. And I think that has to be the solution. I was really heartened by what Colette was saying about the approach the SRA is going to be taking in trying to enforce the AML regulations on the legal sector, because it obviously isn't enough just to have compliance officers who are doing the compliance work. Everyone needs to do that work. Everyone needs to be aware that the money that is moving through accounts, the criminal money, is not just numbers. Every single one represents a person whose life has been destroyed by financial crime. So thanks very much for listening. Now we can get on with the main show. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you, Oliver. That was an excellent, provocative presentation. I'm pleased the final conclusion wasn't that we abolish compliance and we all lose a job. But no, that was excellent. So thank you. And Maya, now your turn to talk a bit about sanctions, I think. So over to you, Maya.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am a barrister. I specialise in sanctions work and in a very wide range of sanctions work. I have a number of different clients from the government, different government departments, private clients, companies, charities, law firms, on all sorts of different issues, from issues of sanctions, contract law, compliance, delistings, investigations for breaches, and so on. One thing I'm not is a compliance lawyer. That tends to be work done by law firms, so probably everyone here is more specialised in the topic that I'm discussing than me. But what I thought I would do is just offer a few observations from my sort of mixed bag of experience dealing with sanctions work on the current landscape for you, for the people at the sharp end of having to comply with sanctions. And I think I have 5 observations on compliance to share with you. First observation is I think everyone in this room has an unbelievably hard job, which has been made an awful lot harder in the last few years. What do I mean by that? I've been doing sanctions work since about 2008-9. Initially, most of the concern was about terrorist sanctions, due process in imposing sanctions, Iran, Syria, North Korea. And I think every few years there is a new wave where a different kind of sanctions comes into focus for people doing compliance work, all very challenging in a different way. So I think, for example, everyone here probably had to get very interested in US sanctions a decade or so ago. The US started being, in a very different way from the way it had used sanctions before, a kind of worldwide force when it came to sanctions, in particular the use of secondary sanctions, very difficult to understand and comply with. The next sort of obvious challenge was Brexit, because for the first time, everyone here was having to deal with the prospect of UK sanctions, which we never had before, because sanctions were something that we had always done through the European Union. So a brand new layer of sanctions compliance was added. But what I really mean, of course, is Russia sanctions, because the pace at which sanctions on Russia were extended when we had the invasion of Ukraine and have been rolled out since then is quite unlike anything anyone in the world of sanctions has ever seen. Both US, UK, those brand new regimes, and EU. It's quite extraordinary how complex and far-reaching those rules now go, as you really don't need telling. And so compliance, I think, has gone from being something about screening different lists to really trying to understand very, very complicated legal rules that those of us who do the job day in, day out often really find it very hard to advise on. In a very fast-moving landscape where some of the rules are drafted at pace, and I think that is showing. They are very vague in many instances, and there's not that much help in trying to understand what they mean. You are also having to deal, quite apart from the sanctions rules and AML, of course, with risk appetites of law firms, banks. Will these transactions be routed even if they're permitted from a compliance perspective? Different sanctions regimes that may also be applicable to situations you're dealing with, export controls and so on. So it really is quite a formidable task. I know this partly because I have tried to draft and be involved in drafting our chamber's policies on sanctions. And, you know, when regulators and others say, you've really got to get your policies in place, that is an unbelievably complex thing in itself, trying to work out what your policy should be, what it needs to cover, and so on. My second observation is that there is a huge spotlight on compliance, because as you probably know, sanctions enforcement, by which I mean investigations of and public fines for breach of sanctions, has been very low in the UK for quite some time. There has been some recently, and we're told to sort of watch this space. So I think there will be more public enforcement. And there is enforcement that we don't see, settlements behind the scenes, investigations taking place and going away without a big public fine. But all that said, I think it is fair to say that the real centre of sanctions enforcement, certainly in the UK, is compliance. The way in which we are expected to put into implementation these very complicated regimes I've described is by complying with them more than being hauled up for criminal penalties. And maybe that's a very good thing, but it just makes the role of that very complex role of compliance even more important, because it is what is relied on to make sure the rules are complied with. Now, third and related point is that we are in the field. I'm very conscious Oliver used the word criminals, and I was sitting there thinking, in this field of strict liability for sanctions breach and extremely vague, complex rules, it's quite easy to be a criminal. We have criminal penalties for sanctions breaches, and we're dealing also with strict liability for breach of some of the sanctions rules. And all of that in the face of rules which really are, in some instances, very hard to interpret. So I know I'm mounting up the pressure here, but the combination of strict liability, criminal liability, and rules which are complex, fast-moving, and hard to understand is a bit of a perfect storm, I think, over the last at least year or possibly more. A few examples of things that are really quite difficult to understand and which are, frankly, my daily bread. Number one, and extraordinarily, who is subject to sanctions is an incredibly vague concept. What do I mean by this? Because, as you all know, it's not just a question of screening sanctions lists. Russia and other sanctions, those very far-reaching restrictions, apply not only to those on lists, but to entities owned or controlled by those on lists. And what that means is an incredibly broad test for what ownership and control means. But it's a test that, as many of you know, recently has had one interpretation by the High Court, a completely different interpretation by the Court of Appeal, and then clarification by the government a few days later. All of this happened, a week ago, about what the government actually meant, which was not the same as what the Court of Appeal judges said. Now, that makes the picture extremely difficult to advise on. Who is subject to the rules is still very unclear. Now, who is to blame for that, we can have a long and interesting discussion about, but it is a fact that it's now very difficult to advise people whether they're sanctioned or not. A second really good example is what you are not allowed to advise on as legal practitioners. The legal services restrictions, again, extremely broadly drafted without consultation with lawyers to some extent. Those are so broadly drafted that in some instances they seem to prohibit compliance work. Now, I think the government pretty quickly realized, after being deluged with concerned approaches from law firms, that actually not being allowed to tell people how to comply with sanctions was not great and probably not intended by the legal services prohibitions. But when you read them, that appears to be what they said. That is still a process that is ongoing. There's now a general license which seeks to permit compliance work, but it's still, I think, fair to say, very unclear what can and can't be done. Your reporting obligations, again, subject to criminal penalties, what it is that you have to report to OFSI, the sanctions part of the Treasury, is a really difficult question. The reporting form is inconsistent with the regulations in many respects, but I find myself advising a lot on, do we need to report this to OFSI or do we not? Again, that is not a particularly satisfactory situation, and one where you will all be aware, you'll have the SRA saying you're not properly doing reporting, but actually trying to understand what you're supposed to be reporting on is very tricky. Another really key one, what do the general licenses permit us to do? In other words, the UK now, happily after Brexit, has the power to issue licenses, not just to permit individual transactions, but whole categories of transactions or situations. But the way the general licenses are drafted, quite often serious uncertainty about whether what you're doing falls within the general license or not. The concept of circumvention of sanctions, which is now a big hot topic among G7 governments. When is somebody circumventing sanctions, and when are they simply acting outside the jurisdiction, for example, is a really difficult question to answer, because the idea of nexus, jurisdictional nexus, is complex. So again, trying to advise clients in this area on compliance, very difficult. And even the rules on strict liability, the way that the government introduced strict liability into the regulations, they didn't produce a new version of the regulations, which now shows you what the legal obligations are. You have to read the existing laws subject to the strict liability rules, which, again, for legal certainty and actually knowing what the law is, very, very difficult. Now, why is this? Basically because of the sheer speed at which these things have been drafted. I think that is really showing now. They were absolutely bashed out under enormous pressure, which one can understand, but it does mean that is now causing serious problems. Fourth observation, really, is how hard this is in terms of the lack of guidance and assistance in this area. So the government are to be commended for, they are required now to give guidance. There is some guidance, by contrast with the previous EU position, which until Russia invaded Ukraine, the EU had no sanctions guidance whatsoever. It now has a bit when it comes to Russia. The UK has some guidance, but it not very much, and in my view, insufficiently helpful and specific guidance to actually try to understand the rules. And for any of you who have tried to approach OFSI, either for a license or for clarification of some of these rules, the problem is, with these waves and waves of sanctions, they are absolutely deluged. And the most common complaint you get in this field is, I asked for clarification in the context of something very time sensitive that I needed an answer on within a week, and it's sort of 11 months later we haven't heard back from the government on this. So this is a system that is really, really strained, very, very strained, and wholly reliant on people trying to comply. Last observation, and this probably goes entirely counter to the spirit of the entire conference, is that my impression is that law firms in this field are genuinely trying to do the right thing. This is not about, wholesale people just not being able to comply with the rules, failing to do their job properly. I did notice the SRA report says that there are some firms, a small number, who are not sufficiently screening clients or future clients to see if they're designated or not. Obviously, that's something that should be done, as a matter of, you've got to know whether you're dealing with a sanctioned party or not, insofar as you can understand the rules. But I really do think this is not an area where, at least as far as I have seen, people are rolling up their sleeves, trying to kind of hide the dirty money and get away with it. The breaches that I have experience of, and that's not to say there aren't far worse ones, are a large number of inadvertent breaches. As we tried to do, we were exiting Russia, this thing happened. Oh dear, what do we now do? Do we report it? How do we work this out? But in a culture where certainly my impression is everyone is trying to comply with these rules, but for the reasons I've set out, it's really not an easy thing to do. Now, I do have a couple of glimmers of optimism to end with, and then I really would be very interested in your experiences on this. But first of all, the head of OFSI, Giles Thompson, made a very interesting statement at a conference about a week ago, where he said that they are not interested in going after people who are genuinely trying to do the right thing. So he says there will be, they've said this a lot, expect more public enforcement decisions, but they're not going after people who are genuinely trying to do the right thing, which seems to me obviously a very sensible policy decision. However, it is still true that trying to do the right thing really only goes to, the enforcement policy of the current government. Are they which cases are they going to bring and which are they not? But also it's about mitigating penalties, because we are in a world of strict liability. So it's fine for him to say, you're not going to get an enormous fine if you're trying to comply. But there is still strict criminal liability for breach of sanctions. So query how far that really gets you, where you'd really rather be in a position where you weren't breaching sanctions at all. I think it's also worth saying in that context that there's quite a lot of loose language in this area. So, sanctions breach, it sounds like a very serious and terrible thing. And obviously, in the context of what Oliver has said, terrible financial crime worldwide, there are really terrible financial crimes. But when so much is criminalized of these rules in the context I've described, it is really quite easy to be the wrong side of the line. I think similarly, one gets the language of the people who are subject to sanctions. One sees a lot in government statements and press. Kleptocrats, anyone who is a lawyer working for somebody who is either complying with sanctions or, even worse, the subject of sanctions is dealing with kleptocrats and cronies. And all I would say in response to that kind of really loose language is go and read the sanctions and see what the criteria are for including people in the sanctions lists. Because yes, there are kleptocrats and cronies, but it is now lawful for the government to sanction people who used to be involved in a sector of the economy in Russia that's important. Now, that includes an awful lot of people who don't, I think, get fairly described as criminals and kleptocrats. And I think a difficulty with that is that there is a bit of a sense that lawyers are treated with a suspicion in this area. And I think one of the less desirable aspects of the fast pace of change is that actually the legal community are there to try to assist, and I think can give an awful lot of help. And that's really my second and final glimmer of hope point, is that there is help for compliance. There is help at hand, as it were. The Law Society have been very effective recently in putting together small groups of lawyers to engage with government on these trickier issues where things are vague. And the SRA also very helpful guidance. And I think because of the storm that happened when Russia sanctions were imposed, there is quite a tight-knit legal community of people doing sanctions work with even, WhatsApp groups and regular meetings, because there is a sort of shared sense among the compliance community of we really all want to try and do the right thing and understand the rules, and sharing know-how, sharing experiences, sharing guidance. It's become a bit like a sort of group therapy session often, I think. Finally, I have tried my best. I have, with a colleague, a website, europeansanctions.com, which we are relaunching as globalsanctions.com because it's not very EU anymore. But we update it several times a day with sanctions developments. And it really is several times a day. Sometimes we have 8, 9 updates on. It's really that fast moving. So to try and adapt the rules and your compliance systems at that kind of pace is very tricky, but that is there for you to use. And we always very much welcome suggestions for things that should be on there that aren't, so that we can all in this together try to comply more effectively. Thank you.
So, welcome back from that recording of our compliance conference, which took place in Birmingham a couple of weeks or so ago. I hope you found the recording useful. Just by way of reminder, I'm now joined by esteemed panelists, Oliver Bullough, who's author and journalist, and Maya Lester-Casey, who's barrister at Brett Court Chambers, and we're here to answer all your questions. So that video took around an hour or so. We've got perhaps 15 minutes or so for questions. We've still got a time for a few questions if you would like to get yours in at the link below. But why don't I start by moving on to some of the questions that we had over the course of that video. So a lot of people submitting anonymous questions, but let me start, and I'll kick off by answering this one. A question from Robin, who's asked, what is the difference between holding client money and managing client money in terms of whether or not the work is in or out of scope of the regulations? So Robin, I think your question is around the money laundering regulations. I'm going to answer it in that context. So the money laundering regulations, the definition talks about managing client money rather than holding client money. So that is the definition that is used in the regulations. Because of our client account rules, you're not permitted to simply hold client money. You're not allowed to use your client account as a banking facility. So generally, my opinion would be that most firms holding client money are actually managing client money in the context of the money laundering regulations. But actually, if you look at the regulations themselves, if you go up a clause, it talks about, in Regulation 12, I think it is, that it's managing client money in the context of company transactions or property transactions. So it's not the holding or managing of client money in and of itself that would bring your firm and that work into scope of the regulations. It's the type of activity for which you are holding that money for. So it's if you're holding money in order to offer property, so property conveyancing services or trust and company services, that would bring your firm into scope. We've published quite a bit of guidance on this on our website. So if you go to sra.org.uk/AML, there's a section in there about what is in scope. So there's some more information about the definitions there, which I hope would be of help. So let me introduce some more questions for our panelists. So I'm going to put this question to Oliver. So in one of your recent newsletters, Oliver, you likened the government to a couch potato who knows they need to get fit. Could you maybe just for the audience, just explain that analogy a little bit and say what more you think the government ought to be doing to prevent economic crime in the UK and globally?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I apologise for my metaphors. I tend to like coming up with ridiculous metaphors. The British government is really good at announcing new measures against economic crime. This isn't a party political point. This goes back through multiple prime ministers and multiple parties going through the coalition back to the Labour days. And what is particularly irritating to me is that they regularly pass new legislation or create new regulations, but never really do anything to make sure that that legislation is in any way used by the law enforcement agencies that should be doing so, because it doesn't sufficiently resource those law enforcement agencies, so they have the people or the technology to use the legislation. So in the quest for a daft metaphor to justify that, and I'd like to point out I came up with it off the top of my head while writing a newsletter, it struck me that like someone who wants to get fit, you know, they're a couch potato, they haven't done any exercise for years, so they buy themselves some fitness equipment, I don't know, maybe a treadmill or an exercise bike, and everyone praises them and says, look, well done, you must be really committed to getting fit. And they really like the praise, they get off on that, so they buy some more exercise equipment, you know, I don't know, some new trainers perhaps, or one of those headbands they used to wear in the 1980s, and everyone keeps praising them for how committed they are. But at some point they're going to have to get on the treadmill or get on the exercise bike, put on the trainers and go out and start running. But once you start doing that, you expose the fact that you're really bad at it. So what we instead have is, you know, Home Secretary after Home Secretary, Prime Minister after Prime Minister, they have focused on buying new exercise equipment by passing new pieces of legislation rather than by actually using the exercise equipment and getting fit. So what does the government need to do? It needs to stop buying itself new exercise equipment and actually using what it already has. It needs to use unexplained wealth orders, and that means resourcing the National Crime Agency sufficiently. It needs to actually use the new powers which have just been gifted to Companies House by allowing Companies House to put the price of a company up, or giving Companies House some money so we can verify the information filed with it, and so on. Sadly, I have no confidence that it will actually do that, because I have no confidence that they actually particularly care about getting fit. They just like to be praised by the newspapers for making the effort.
Thanks, Oliver. Really interesting answer and really, really interesting question. And of course, during the passage of time between the recording of the video and now, we've had the Economic Crime Act now become the Economic Crime and Transparency Bill. So a lot of those new measures have now passed into legislation. So it'll be really interesting to see how the government chooses to use those. So let's move on to some more questions. So this is an anonymous one that perhaps I'll kick off on and then maybe ask Maya to chip in on. So the question is, can you confirm, are we required to do background and sanctions checks for each and every client? These are hard to complete because we're an immigration firm, so we have a large proportion of our clients that do not have 2 years residence or ID documents. So I think the question is in relation to 2 separate regimes, and there's going to be 2 separate answers for that. So to kick off by talking about the money laundering regulations, the requirements under that, probably your work, if it's pure immigration services, are probably not going to be in scope of the money laundering regulations, unless perhaps you're offering some auxiliary, say, tax advice, for example. But typically immigration work generally outside of scope of the money laundering regulations. So actually proving doing identification and verification in the money laundering regulations falls away because the regulations themselves don't apply. However, you do have requirements under sanctions legislation, and that isn't about proving the identity of the person, but it's checking against a list that they are not a designated person and they're someone that you can charge for providing advice to. So we, again, at the SRA have produced quite a lot of advice on this. If you go to sra.org.uk/sanctions, there's quite a lot of guidance about what we suggest you do for work outside of scope. But my advice would be, given a check on the OFSI website is free to run a sanctions check, you know, it's a really good idea just to do that basic check on clients. But Maya, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add on sort of basic sanctions checks.
Well, just that, I mean, in addition to it being relatively straightforward to run a sanctions check, at least on UK sanctions, and you can also check whether they're sanctioned in other jurisdictions for free as well. We have a target search on europeansanctions.com, but there are plenty of similar things. It's also, it is very important to know whether the person you're working for is sanctioned or not, because it will depend whether and how you can get paid, whether you require licenses for payment. There are also reporting obligations to report if you have information relating to designated people of various different kinds. So although it might be a pain to add to the checks, I think it is a good idea with all clients. Can I also, just on the previous question, agree very much with what Oliver said about use of gym equipment, as it were. But I think what particularly struck me was, if you look at the recent Sam Bankman-Fried prosecution and conviction in the US, what really struck me about that was the extremely streamlined way in which that happened, how incredibly quickly he was prosecuted in a very simple way without too much sort of getting bogged down in crypto. It was a sort of vanilla fraud case, and conviction came very quickly. And I did wonder about the contrast with our prosecution record of serious financial crime in the UK. So I agree entirely with Oliver. It's partly a matter of resourcing. I also wonder whether it's a slightly more complex matter of the culture. The SFO and other bodies have had so many quite high profile collapses of serious prosecutions that, query, is there now a more risk averse approach? You see the same in the world of sanctions. Enforcement record in the US is just, streets ahead of that approach in the UK. So I just wanted to also agree with that answer.
Thanks, Maya. And I think one of the things that is really interesting in the new economic crime bill is this new failure to prevent fraud offence that that isn't enacted yet, but will be enacted once we see statutory guidance published by government. And I think that will be very interesting to see what that guidance said. But Oliver, is there anything else that you wanted to come in on off the back of Maya's comments then?
No, I mean, I thought it was a really interesting point about the FTX Sam Bankman-Fried case. And, partly, I suppose, that's about prosecutorial powers, the ability that prosecutors have in the US to threaten people with essentially an eternity in jail if they don't cooperate is something, obviously, there are prosecutors don't have. But it also goes into a well-resourced investigative system and a well-resourced court system, which is frankly something that we just don't have. And that is one of the things that's very depressing if you spend time trying to interest anyone in financial crime, that it just all runs aground in this sort of, we'd love to do something about it, but oh, whoops, we can't.
Super. Thanks, Oliver. So let's move on perhaps to another technical question that I might pick up. So this is a question about, again, this is another anonymous one. What is the difference between anti-money laundering, firm-wide risk assessment, and a sanctions risk assessment? And similarly, what's the difference between a client and a matter risk assessment? So these, let me take the first part of that question first, the difference between anti-money laundering risk assessment, firm-wide risk assessment, and sanctions risk assessment. So two completely different regimes, again, on this one. So the money laundering regulations, if you're in scope, it is a legislative requirement to have a documented firm-wide risk assessment. That's a requirement under Regulation 18 of the money laundering regulations, and has been since 2017. So it's a long-standing regulation. We produce loads of guidance on how to do this. There's a template, there's a Q&A, there's a checklist out there. It is an area that we do still continue to see issues and firms struggling with. So if you're doing work in scope of the money laundering regulations, make sure you've got firm-wide risk assessment in place, make sure it's documented, make sure it's kept up to date. A sanctions risk assessment is not a statutory requirement, but it is a really good idea for all law firms, whether or not you're doing work in or out of scope of the money laundering regulations. Again, we've published quite a lot of guidance about what should be in that and how to go about doing it. So it's best practice to have a documented sanctions risk assessment, and it's something that if we come and do a sanctions desk-based review or on-site inspection, we'll be asking to see that as sort of a starting point for any inquiries that come after that. So let's perhaps move on to another question, and I might bring Oliver in on this one, and possibly also Maya. So Patricia has asked, given we work on a global scale beyond UK borders, has Brexit been a spanner in the works for the fight against money laundering? Is the UK completely flying alone with its sanctions, or keeping in line with those coming in from the EU? So perhaps if I bring in Oliver to perhaps reflect on how the UK is doing in a global context, and sort of any thoughts on perhaps impact of Brexit, and then perhaps Maya, you might comment on whether we're keeping track with the EU.
Yeah, I'm going to keep this brief because I want to hear what Maya has to say. But I mean, there is a sort of Brexit-related myth that the reason we left the European Union was because the European Union was doing so much to fight money laundering, that the UK was finding it uncomfortable and wanted to leave to allow our money launderers free rein. That isn't true. The EU is just as bad at it as we are. Frankly, we just have far more of it, so it's a more significant failure. And there are very few countries in Europe that are doing well fighting financial crime, of which Spain and Italy are probably the two outstanding examples. But I don't think Brexit has had a huge impact, just because there wasn't really very much to impact. Much of the cooperation that we do have is via the Five Eyes network or separately with the Netherlands. And that happens much more on sort of bilateral or multilateral via Five Eyes basis. So no, I'm not convinced that Brexit has had much effect. And I certainly don't subscribe to the conspiracy theory that Brexit was all about allowing criminals free rein to move money around. And now I want to hear what Maya has to say about sanctions.
I mean, it's a very interesting question. So enforcement of sanctions was never something that we did as a team with the EU. That was always something that countries did individually and continue to do. I mean, I think as a general matter, cooperation between the UK and the EU and the US, Australia, Canada, others is pretty good when it comes to sanctions. I think, Brexit has not had an impact on that in a significantly negative way. I mean, if anyone is interested in the detail on this, I gave evidence to a House of Lords EU Affairs Committee last week, who have taken a lot of evidence specifically on the issue of the impact of Brexit on EU-UK relations when it comes to sanctions and other similar areas. And I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has had a great effect on the degree of cooperation between countries when it comes to sanctions, because certainly the EU came together at least for quite a long period of time, but coordination, particularly through the G7 between the UK, the EU and the US on sanctions, has been pretty effective. I think where sanctions haven't aligned entirely, that's a matter of sort of policy choice. We do things differently in certain respects rather than a kind of failure of communication or alignment. But as I say, on the enforcement front, we continue to go it alone, but with pretty good cooperation. So I think the system of mutual legal assistance requests, helping each other in pursuit of prosecuting financial crime cross-border, operates relatively effectively. And to the extent that things are not getting prosecuted, it's more for the reasons we were talking about earlier than a failure to have cooperation across borders.
Thanks very much, both. So we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. So there's one that's come in as a bit more of a technical question, but it's something that came up a lot when we did the conference live and also at the session that I did earlier in the week. So again, this is another anonymous question. Is it necessary to obtain documentary evidence with regard to source of funds or source of wealth? A lot of the information we obtain is from the client or partner. So again, this is a question about the source of fund requirements checks under the money laundering regulations. So yes, if the requirement to do source of fund checks, so you'll remember that you must do source of fund checks where necessary, source of wealth checks if you've got a politically exposed person or a high-risk third country. If you are doing those, then it's absolutely essential that you are getting documentary evidence and you're documenting those checks that you're doing. It's absolutely fine to obtain the information from the client, and in fact, if you're asking for bank statements, and of course you will be obtaining those from the client, but make sure that you are doing some due diligence on those. So we see on occasion times where people have gotten documentary evidence of source of funds, but it's absolutely clear that they just haven't read them. They've just put them on the file because there are spelling errors all over bank statements, or the bank statements have got the wrong logos against them. So yes, documenting your process is really important. It's also really important if we come and do a desk-based review or an on-site inspection, we'll be looking to see that documentation is in place. And then the final question, which I'll kick off on, but I might just ask Maya and Oliver to come in on sort of their views on culture. So I think this is a really challenging question. I'm going to sort of paraphrase the question a little bit because it's quite lengthy. The question is around what we think the culture of compliance should be, and what can compliance officers do if they're not getting support from senior management. How can we as a supervisor support officers to be making those changes, and sort of any tips on creating a culture of compliance. So I think this is something that I spoke a bit about on the main stage session. I think culture is something that increasingly we do see influences firms' outcomes. I think making sure that you've got the right level of people in really important posts, such as money laundering compliance officer and money laundering reporting officer, is really important. I think senior leaders absolutely need to be bought in on why we're doing this. So, you know, the reasons for preventing economic crime, which Oliver spoke about so eloquently in his presentation. You know, there is almost certainly a hearts and minds chat that can be had with senior leaders. And then I think in terms of disseminating that culture, training is something that is really important and something that we see really does make a difference. Again, I might refer you to our website about the guidance that we've published for money laundering compliance officers, money laundering reporting officers. It's called the 3 pillars of compliance, I think it's called. It's on our website, and it's guidance for money laundering reporting officers, money laundering compliance officers, about how to get the best out of those roles. But I think just if I bring in perhaps Oliver and then Maya on sort of any closing remarks and sort of any thoughts that you have on selling the message in firms.
I mean, I spend a lot of time researching money laundering and talking to compliance officers and reading compliance documents, and I find my brain gets fogged very quickly with acronyms and procedures and regulations, and it's very hard to remember what this is about. And what it is about is that money laundering is the support industry for the worst people in the world, and stopping even a tiny bit of that is a good thing. So I just think it's something for, and maybe this is a question of culture or a question of information, or I'm not sure, but it is something that it's always important to make sure everyone bears in mind, that this isn't about regulations or satisfying the regulators. It's about stopping criminals, and stopping criminals from inflicting terrible harm on their victims. And any way you can make sure that remains front of mind, if not all the time, then some of the time, is good. And so essentially, I'd just like to say thank you to all the compliance people, and please keep it up, really, because, you know, it's incredibly important, and I suspect a lot of the time it feels incredibly frustrating.
I mean, I would simply add, so I agree with that. It's sort of all in a good cause, as it were. But I think the other incentive
I suppose, is that the message that does come out of all the regulators, and certainly the sanctions regulator, is that if you make a good faith effort to comply and get proper systems up and running, it's very unlikely that you will face harsh penalties, and also that you do have excellent support, including on detailed answers to questions of the kind we've been talking about today from the SRA. So I think with that in mind, it's hopefully an achievable task.
Thank you, Maya. So I think that comes to the end of our allotted time, and in fact, apologies, I think we've run slightly over. So I'd like to say a massive thank you again to Oliver and Maya. Really appreciate you joining us for Q&A today and also at the conference. Thank you for those of you at home for joining. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. Any questions that we didn't manage to get to, what we'll do is we'll take a look at those and see if we can pick them up on future webinars. If you've got specific questions that you didn't get answered, take a look at the resources online. We also have our ethics helpline who you can call, who can give support on specific questions. So I think it's been a really, really interesting session, but of course we want to know what you think, specifically whether this format worked for you, how we can improve it. So please do click on the feedback link below and let us know what you thought. So this is one of a series of sessions that are being shown from our Compliance Officers Conference this week. The next one is coming up very shortly, so it will be SQE, what it means for law firms, and that's going to be happening in 40 minutes at 2 o'clock, so do tune in for that. So thank you ever so much for joining today, and we'll look forward to seeing you again very soon.